Good morning. Welcome to History Comes Alive. Today we're looking at the Panama Canal, the Big Dig. So my subtitle is The Big Dig, first century of the Big Dig, as the canal was referred to occasionally. Everything about the canal is big. I know many of you have been to the canal, probably passing through it on a cruise ship. I've not had that opportunity, but my wife and I did travel down there a few years ago and stayed at the only eco resort in the entire stretch of the canal. It's in Gamboa, and had actually been built during the construction of the canal. So fascinating place to see from the ground level and see the ships passing by. I also had occasion to be stationed there for short periods of time in the 1990s on various military training missions when the canal was in the process eventually of transitioning from US to Panamanian control. So a lot of angles to this story. And on that point about size, as I said, everything about the canal is big. It was the largest construction project in US history, involved the largest public health campaign up to that point, created the world's largest artificial lake, and sadly for the French, it created the worst financial scandal of the 19th century. But at the end of the day, canal represents a triumph of American ingenuity over nature. And along the way, we were able to show the French a thing or two after their disastrous attempt to build the canal. So here we go. First of all, I want to show you some old machines. So the canal is in fact a machine. It's worked perfectly from the very beginning. Now, would you trust your life to a 100-year-old automobile or a 100-year-old airplane? Probably not. And this, dear friends, is the sidewalk at my home 10 years after it was built. You can see the concrete crumbling, flaking off the surface due to shoddy construction. And of course, the Panama Canal is made of concrete and still going strong after now 106 years. Well, Panama Canal has always been of interest, if not by name, ever since Balboa on the left there crossed the Isthmus of Panama, the area circled. He crossed that area to discover the Pacific. And that inspired a long dream to cut the continents, North and South America, and find an easier way to get through the continental divide. And again, the isthmus is the ideal spot to do that, 48 miles wide, and the hills from the Rockies to the north to the Andes to the south, probably at their lowest point at the isthmus. Now, in the 16th century, Spain began shipping gold and silver overland, mostly from the conquered Inca Empire in Peru. King Charles of Spain ordered a government survey to try to find a better route across the isthmus rather than mule trains. He was unsuccessful in that attempt. In the 19th century, revival of interest in finding a shortcut across the Isthmus of Panama. The French adventurer Louis de la Charme in 1866 was one of many adventurers seeking an easier route across the isthmus. The US got in the act after the California gold rush of 1849. Panama provided a shortcut. If you were on the East Coast, wanted to get west to California, if you could avoid going around Cape Horn, you would cut your sea journey from 13,000 miles to 5,000 miles. So a great advantage trying to find a way across. And in fact, the US did find a way as early as 1855. The US negotiated a treaty with Colombia. Panama at the time was a province of Colombia. The treaty provided free transit rights across the isthmus in return for US guarantees of Colombian sovereignty. So in 1855, American investors built a railroad, the Panama Railroad, and it is still running in somewhat diminished fashion. I think it's available for tourists occasionally. although at the time I was there in the 90s with the military, it was off limits due to pickpockets and other skullduggery on this railroad. Now, I'm going to go back to this slide here and show you that Panama wasn't the only way to get across the isthmus. You could also cross through Nicaragua via stagecoach and then across this huge lake in central Nicaragua. The route is actually 500 miles shorter than going by way of Panama on a train, and it remained, and in some minds still remains, a viable alternative to the Panama Canal. The French ultimately obtained rights to transit the canal, and their interest was stoked by the gentleman shown here on the right. He's got an auger. He's drilling in between North and South America, a very iconic image. Ferdinand de Lesseps, a country gentleman, had no background in management, no background in engineering, no background in finance, but he was an extraordinary entrepreneur, confident, charming, a man of unlimited energy. He'd been the driving force behind the creation of the Suez Canal, showed at the bottom there, in 1869. He was hailed as Le Grand Français, the great Frenchman. And in Panama, after his adventure in Egypt, de Lesseps was looking for new worlds to conquer. So he comes up with the idea of a sea-level canal in Panama. So I have a photograph from Panama superimposed over an image of the Suez Canal. And I ask you, dear audience, what is the difference between those two pictures? Quite obvious, a difference of geography, heat with the jungle there, and especially rainfall. A very different environment between Panama and Egypt. De Lesseps convened an international congress in 1879. The Americans were skeptical. They presented data showing that a canal through Nicaragua would be cheaper, easier to build, even though longer, but much of it would be across, again, as I said, that lake in Nicaragua. But by virtue of the force of his personality, his reputation, de Lesseps persuades the Congress to support Panama. And I should point out, without any irony, up until that point, de Lesseps had never set foot in Panama. But he has now committed himself and committed his nation to building a canal. If de Lesseps had been to Panama, he would have appreciated what he was up against. The problem is the Chagres River flowing here. Again, this is an image before the canal was built. The river during flood expands by about 80 times its normal volume. Just along this 47-mile run of the river, there are 303 bridges and culverts to handle this annual influx of water. And also you have the Culebra mountain range here, low but still very difficult to punch your way through. But de Lesseps was undeterred. He was quoted as saying, "For every difficulty, there is a man of genius capable of meeting and conquering it. What worked in Suez will work in Panama." Well, we shall see. In 1880, de Lesseps joins with French banks to issue stock in what was called the Interoceanic Universal Canal Company. I happened to buy a few shares myself on eBay a few years ago. The stock issue raised $60 million from 100,000 investors in 3 days. The company is incorporated with de Lesseps as president, and later the company issues bonds. What's shown here in the image are some of these canal bonds. Became the hottest financial deal of the 19th century. Between the stocks and the bonds, eventually de Lesseps raised $240 million from 450,000 investors, almost all of them ordinary Frenchmen, like these folks here on the left, probably getting a sales pitch for shares in the greatest enterprise of the age and a significant mark of French technical superiority in building this canal. Paul Gauguin was among those who flocked to the canal not for investment returns, but for work. Gauguin signed on as a laborer on the canal, but after a few weeks he was fired for fighting and drunkenness. We don't know of anything that he painted while he was in Panama, but he made enough money to move on to Martinique, eventually to Tahiti. And in his case, the rest is history, art history. The French started digging in 1882. They gave it a go. The French workforce eventually peaked at 19,000. And here's an image of the kind that would have appeared in French newspapers, a fanciful image hyping the so-called progress on the canal. But in fact, the reality on the scene was very different. These photographs suggest some of the problems the French encountered. First of all, you can sense from that image on the right the presence of endemic disease. Tropical disease was a killer. Malaria, continuous, periodic yellow fever outbreaks. At its worst, disease was killing 40 workers per day. And nobody on the French project was exempt from disease. Most of them were poor black laborers from the Caribbean, buried in mass graves. But disease also claimed the lives of the chief engineer, his wife, son, and daughter. And on the left, you see an image suggesting the technical challenges of building the canal. The equipment was never up to the massive task of especially cutting through the Culebra Range. It actually hadn't been invented yet, and this was a later advantage to the U.S. Coming on the scene a couple decades later, the construction equipment had advanced considerably. The French also were dogged by financial corruption. Money poured into the canal company, wasted on bribes to politicians, fees to bankers, payoffs to newspapers for running those glowing illustrations, overcharging by suppliers and contractors. And what's most astounding, and this is pointed out in a book, I want to show this here back on camera, The Path Between the Seas, there you go, by David McCullough. Absolutely fascinating book. He literally wrote the book on the history of the Panama Canal. This dates from 1977. Tremendous resource for my presentation. Highly recommend it to you. But McCullough makes the astounding conclusion that the French never really had a plan for how they would build the canal. They thought they would just keep digging a ditch like the Suez Canal in Egypt. They never really figured out how to control the raging Chagres River. By 1889, the French effort collapsed. The company was bankrupt. Most investors lost everything. Government ministers were implicated in corruption scandals. De Lesseps nearly went to jail over this collapse. He was fined. His jail term was overturned on a technicality. He died a few years later in disgrace. A very small funeral was held for de Lesseps, did not even mention his effort to build the Panama Canal. His funeral was paid for by the Suez Canal Company. In 1894, the canal company was reformed as a shell just to keep the works in saleable condition. Most of the equipment was useless, but some buildings could be rehabilitated. Jungle had been cleared, and a lot of the excavation carried out by the French actually was incorporated into the American plan, like this photograph here of the Culebra Cut. But the French, at the end of the day, only removed about 1/6 of the amount of earth and rock that was eventually required to build the canal. The final toll for the French, devastating. Cost the French investors $287 million, the most expensive peacetime undertaking in history up to that point, 20,000 people dead, and a humiliating financial and psychological defeat for France. Now, on the scene comes America. This is not an actual photograph. This is President Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, reimagined as the Hulk. and he was a larger-than-life character. He embodied a new American spirit at the turn of the 20th century. He wrote, "Far better it is to dare mighty things, to win glorious triumphs, than to live in the gray twilight that knows neither victory nor defeat." Teddy Roosevelt took office in 1901, and he saw that America was destined to become a great world power. And this ambition was embodied in the Great White Fleet, a fleet of 16 battleships sailing around the world between 1907 and 1909. Roosevelt had actually been Secretary of the Navy before he was president, and he knew that naval dominance was key to America's destiny, especially having seen the results of the Spanish-American War when it took 67 days for a battleship to travel from San Francisco to the Caribbean, going around Cape Horn. He knew that it was essential that the U.S. find a better, quicker way to move ships between the Atlantic and the Pacific. So we need a canal somewhere in Central America. In his first message to Congress, Teddy Roosevelt said, "No single great material work which remains to be undertaken on this continent is of such consequence to the American people." So his motivation was not commerce, not civilization, but national defense in building the canal. But the question remains, where do you put it? The Americans looked at the French and felt their efforts were marred by incompetence, decadence, and the French chose the wrong place. Most Americans at the turn of the 20th century favored Nicaragua. It was politically stable, had a healthier climate. The route across would be cheaper, easier, 500 miles shorter. And in 1901, a presidential commission declares for Nicaragua. But a couple of mysterious figures are working behind the scenes for Panama. One of them in particular, the gentleman showed on the right, Philippe Bunau-Varilla, a former engineer, a major stockholder in the French company, had a vested interest in the resale of whatever remained of the French effort. And Bunau-Varilla convinces the company to lower its asking price to $40 million. In other words, he said, as a stockholder, we'll do well if we can sell whatever's left of the French effort for $40 million. Then he proceeds to lobby the Trump administration, the Roosevelt administration very vigorously. And in 1900, as part of his lobbying effort, he sends a letter to all the American senators with this stamp attached. And the stamp shows volcanic activity in Nicaragua. And in his letter to the U.S. Senate, Bunau-Varilla writes, "This is an official witness to the volcanic activity in Nicaragua." Even though the presence of a volcano wouldn't make any difference to the operation of a canal, this was sufficient, along with other lobbying tactics, to persuade the American Senate to okay the route through Panama in 1902. There's one problem. The U.S. could buy the French works on the canal, the diggings, remains of buildings, and so on. But Panama is still sovereign territory of Colombia. Remember, Panama is a province of Colombia. The U.S. offers Colombia $10 million for a lease. But Colombia had just gone through a civil war. The government was in dire financial straits, and they hold out for more. At which point, Teddy Roosevelt, determined to get his canal, says, "We may have to give a lesson to those jackrabbits." Fortunately for Roosevelt, for a couple of years, a separatist movement had been underway in Panama, and Bunau-Varilla appears on the scene again, acting as a go-between between the U.S. government and the Panamanian independence movement. Very helpfully, He himself drafts a Declaration of Independence for Panama. He writes a constitution, and his wife designs and sews a flag for Panama, an independent Panama. And Buenaventura also comes up with $100,000 in cash to pay off the Colombian army garrison in Panama so they won't interfere. Teddy Roosevelt, for his part, sends a Navy cruiser to Panama on maneuvers. And while the cruiser is a short ways out into the Caribbean, it's able to block the Colombian Navy from sending reinforcements to the small garrison in Panama City. This is a classic example of gunboat diplomacy, wielding a big stick while speaking softly. In November 1903, the revolutionaries mount a coup, take over the government. The fighting is over in 48 hours. Only 2 casualties, a Chinese merchant and his donkey, hit by stray naval gunfire from offshore. And within 1 hour after learning of the coup, the US government recognizes the independence of Panama. A treaty is signed, and soon thereafter, America strikes a permanent lease with the new country of Panama for $10 million, the same lease terms offered and rejected by the Colombians. The lease gives America virtual sovereignty over a 10-mile wide strip of land going through the isthmus, area that becomes known as the Canal Zone. So, as a result of all this skullduggery, gunboat diplomacy, the Panamanians get a country, and America gets a canal. In the photograph on the left, or the illustration on the left, Roosevelt shovels his critics aside. In 1904, excavation gets underway. Teddy Roosevelt issues an order to make the dirt fly. 2 years later, he gets a first-hand look at the construction. You can see him seated here on a giant steam shovel, part of the new US equipment brought to the effort. Steam shovels like this, 4 times the capacity of anything the French had. And this, for Roosevelt, proves to be a master public relations stroke to build confidence in the project on the part of the American people. Here's a cartoon in the British magazine Puck, capturing the gung-ho mood of the enterprise. It shows Teddy Roosevelt as though he's leading the Rough Riders, that famous volunteer regiment he led up San Juan Hill in the Spanish-American War. Looks all very exciting, all very inspiring, but initially things didn't go well for the US effort. Construction project became bogged down in bureaucracy. Deaths began to hit the American workforce, low morale, fatalism. Probably reached a low point when the chief engineer, John Wallace, ordered a metal coffin to be shipped to Panama for his potential use. A big change comes in 1905. John Wallace quits, never had to use his metal coffin, thankfully, and the Canal Commission appoints as chief engineer the chief engineer of the Great Northern Railroad. Railroad builders out west. John Stevens takes over in 1905. Tough guy, but very smart. He takes over and stops the excavation because he knew the first thing he had to deal with was the mosquito. The mosquitoes that helped kill the French effort, the mosquitoes that threatened to do the same for the US, spreading malaria and especially yellow fever. Stevens gets help from Teddy Roosevelt. He appeals to the president directly. The president appoints an Army doctor, Colonel William Gorgas, as chief of sanitation. Gorgas was a noted expert in tropical diseases. He had already eliminated yellow fever in Havana, Cuba, by eliminating the mosquito. And he knew we had to do the same thing in Panama. So Gorgas declares war on the mosquito. Mosquitoes thrive in standing water, streets, cisterns, water jars, the canal excavations, even in hospitals in Panama. To control ants, hospitals would put the feet of beds into pots of water. So literally inches away from hospital patients, you have mosquitoes breeding. Not a very sanguinary environment. So Gorgas gets rid of the water by cleaning up the cities at either end of the canal route. Panama City in the south, and shown here is Colón in the north in Panama. On the right, you can see the muddy streets before Gorgas engaged in his campaign. On the left, things have cleaned up considerably. Water containers outside are banned. Screens are installed in buildings. An army of inspectors descends on private homes to ensure that regulations are followed. And perhaps most important, Gorgas launches a campaign to eradicate mosquitoes by smothering their larvae with oil or kerosene in any potential spots where they might be breeding. Within 1.5 years, yellow fever is gone from Panama. But we're not ready to build the canal quite yet. Stevens also realized we needed to start building infrastructure to support this massive construction project. Essentially, he creates a little America inside the canal zone with hotels, commissaries, clubhouses, baseball league, 39 churches with 15 full-time chaplains. The chaplains, by the way, were paid for by the US government under the sanitation department budget. Evidently, there was a solid link between keeping the streets clean and keeping the morals of the workforce clean. At its peak in 1906, the American effort involved 24,000 workers, of whom about 1,500 were American citizens. Other than free medical care, most canal workers didn't enjoy the amenities that the Americans did, especially the black laborers from the West Indies, mostly from Barbados, who made up the bulk of the workforce. In fact, most of those who died in the canal construction died from accident or disease. Most of them were blacks from the Caribbean. Only about 350 white Americans died in the construction of the canal. And these two photographs compare the living conditions between the Caribbean families living in their hovels on the right, and on the left is a spiffy for its time home for an American worker and his family. White workers were paid an average of $150 per month to work on the canal. The black workers were paid about $25 per month, but that was still a small fortune compared to what they were making back home. By 1906, John Stevens has the mosquito beaten, facilities are up and running, and the workforce is now digging away. But there's still some uncertainty about the plan for the American Canal. Politicians in Washington were still assuming the canal would be a sea-level canal, such as the French proposed. But Stevens is convinced he needs a total and radically new approach. His idea is to tame the Chagres River and use the tremendous volume that builds up over the center of the isthmus to fill a lake. And the lake would be used to lift ships 85 feet up and over the Culebra Ridge. He meets with Teddy Roosevelt to persuade him personally of this approach. Now, the canal has no pumps. So how does it work? Not a perpetual motion machine. And really, until you've seen the canal operating in person from the visitor's center, it's a little bit hard to envision this. But the ships are moved up and over the isthmus through the water available in the lake. Water is constantly flowing down from the lake by force of gravity, and the water is continually replenished by the heavy rainfall in Panama. And so, in effect, the rainfall falling down into the lake provides the energy to make the whole thing work. And I have a video animation here just to show you how the canal works. Clear as mud. Well, in 1907, John Stevens quit as chief engineer, probably as a result of overwork. He may have been near a nervous breakdown. And Teddy Roosevelt taps a successor as chief engineer, somebody who can't quit, an Army engineer, Major George Washington Goethals. What a name for an American enterprise, George Washington Goethals. And for the next 77 years, Goethals runs the canal construction and the canal zone administration like a dictator, but he does get the job done. This photograph shows some of the excavation work, 5 times the amount of earth and rock removed as the French were able to accomplish, and that dirt, rock, is used to build the dam on Gatun Lake and a causeway, a breakwater that extends out into the Pacific on the Panama City side of the canal. 500 train loads a day remove all this earth and rock, and this really represents the legacy of John Stevens, the railroad man who knew that it was just as important, if not more important, to carry this stuff away as it was to do the initial digging. The most spectacular achievement of the canal construction were the massive locks. 3 pairs of locks, 1 pair on the northern end, 2 on the southern end. The locks are 1,000 feet long, 110 feet wide. They can fill in 8 minutes without pumps. 25 million gallons of water flows in 8 minutes. And these spectacular gates, 80 feet high, you can see they're dwarfed by 2 gentlemen down here. 600-ton gates, so cleverly engineered that they could be moved by 2 25-horsepower motors. Astounding achievement. Now, the eventual promise of the canal was only hinted at on August 15th, 1914, when this cargo ship, the SS Ancon, opened the canal with the first official transit. There was no big media splash at the time. Some of you may know this would be a good quiz question. What is happening in the world in August 1914? Well, World War I has just broken out with the German invasion of Belgium. So the eyes of the world were elsewhere at the time of the canal's opening. But since it opened, the importance of the canal to world commerce has been proven. 5% of all maritime trade passes through the Panama Canal. More than 1 million ships since it opened, and 1 human being crossed the canal, the famous adventurer Richard Halliburton. In 1928, he swam the canal, and based on his weight, he paid the lowest recorded toll for a transit of the canal, 36 cents. The highest toll, by the way, was paid by a cruise ship in 2010, $375,000 for the privilege of this 12-hour sail through the canal, up 85 feet, down again on the other side, to the amazement of all the tourists on board the ship. In recent years, the canal has come under new management. In 1968, Omar Torrijos, shown here, took over as dictator of Panama. And in 1977, negotiated a treaty with Jimmy Carter to transition the canal to Panamanian control. The Senate narrowly approved the treaty enabling that transition by a vote of 68 to 32. And by 1999, the U.S. was gone from Panama. After Torrijos died in 1983, again during this transitional period, Torrijos died and Manuel Noriega, there's his prison photograph, took over. Relations with the U.S. deteriorated. President Bush directed an invasion of Panama in December of 1989 to remove Noriega from office. Noriega was implicated in drug trafficking. He had annulled a democratic election. Lives of American civilians and military personnel were being threatened by his thugs. And so in the biggest military action since the Vietnam War, U.S. forces ousted Noriega. 23 Americans were killed. Widespread looting swept over, especially Panama City. Here's an armored vehicle, the U.S. forces, parked in the entrance to a laundromat. So a very tense time, very dangerous time in Panama. But after a few days, Noriega was captured and convicted of drug trafficking, money laundering. He spent some time in prison in Miami, where that photograph was taken. Later, extradited to France to face charges, ended up back in a Panamanian prison where he died in 2017. Meanwhile, like many of us, the Panama Canal was showing its age. It's amazing that the electrical innards of the canal still function. The photograph on the left shows a lot of the original electrical equipment still in place. And this from a time in 1914 when most factories were not yet electrified. But the problem facing the canal was the size of its locks. 110 feet wide, 1,000 feet long, increasingly limited traffic through the canal. The photograph shows the largest vehicle type, or the largest ship type that could get through the canal, referred to as a Panamax ship. And you can see it's a very tight fit. And I know those of you who may have seen the Panama Canal either on board your ship or from the visitor center, when you look down, you can barely see the gap between the ships and the walls of the canal. So obviously, space limitations hurting its utility. To address the problem, the Panama Canal Authority, which had taken over from the Americans in running the canal, launched a major expansion project in 2007. The project added a new set of locks at either end of the canal. The new locks are 1,400 feet long, 180 feet wide, nearly triple the size of ships now could pass through the canal. And this is not a photograph, but a computer graphic from before the construction was complete. And it shows these innovative basins here, water basins, that would capture about 60% of the water as ships are going up and down. So the water, instead of all being flushed out to the Pacific or the Caribbean, a lot of it is shunted to one side as the ships are passing in one direction and then released back into the canal as ships are going in the opposite direction. A very clever way to save water, minimize environmental impact, because there's only so much rain that falls on Gatun Lake every year. The canal expansion was originally to cost about $5 billion, originally supposed to be finished in time for the 100th anniversary in 2014. But as typically happens, construction delays, work stoppages, quarrels over financing The completion was pushed back. Another $1 billion was thrown at the problem. And finally, in 2016, June 26th, the canal opens for business. I should point out here that despite the cost overruns on the new canal expansion, the original canal was finished 6 months early and $23 million under budget. Not the case with the expanded canal. So here it is on opening day. The first ship to pass through is a container ship from China. Where else? But old ideas die hard. In 2013, a Chinese investment group proposed building a canal through Nicaragua, a competitive canal at a cost of about $50 billion. Eventually, a local opposition, a collapse in funding, drove a stake in the heart of this project in 2018. So there is the canal, and I hope for those of you who have not had an opportunity to transit the canal or see it from the shore, I hope at some point you have an opportunity to do that. Panama is a safe country. The endemic diseases long since under control. Government is relatively stable for Central America, for Latin America, and highly recommend the Gamboa Rainforest Resort if you want to spend a few days on the ground in Panama enjoying the tropical atmosphere. Next week, we head east, away from the Panama Canal to Russia. We'll be looking at 1,000 years of Russian history through the lens of the route of the Tsars. So we'll be traveling roughly on the route. Again, speaking of tourism, this is the route that you would take if you were doing the standard 2.5 week river cruise of Russia from St. Petersburg to Moscow, along the river, and of course spending a lot of time at both ends in the current and the former capital of Russia. This is a two-part program, so the first session next week will take us up to about 1800. So we'll get as far as Catherine the Great if we move along in due course. And then 1 week later, we'll be picking up the story with the 19th century and especially all the upheavals that have engulfed Russia and the Russian people since the Russian Revolution, 1917. So it'll be part travelogue, part history. We'll see and learn about a lot of fascinating aspects of the Russian nation, its people, and its culture. And you'll also perhaps understand better a framework for why the enduring tension between Russia and the West. So I look forward to seeing you next week for part 1 of our travel along the route of the Tsars through 1,000 years of Russian history. See you then.